This is September the 27th, 2022. Liam O'Gogan here. I'm just reflecting on an article that I saw in the independent.ie this morning. So the title of the article is Wexford GAA call a crisis meeting to address referee concerns. And it's in relation to comments made by the Wexford County Board Chairman, Micheál Martin. And it's dated September the 27th. But the section that I want to draw your attention to is this section here. This quotation from him. He said, "There has been an erosion of the respect and authority for decision makers at all levels in society in that time." He said, "The GAA, because we cross every parish, in our case in the county, is a reflection of society, and it has got to the stage where every decision is challenged, and it manifests itself on social media as well." So when I saw this morning, it triggered in my mind. I'd heard an interview with Micheál Martin, that's the Wexford County Board manager, on the News at 1 yesterday on RTE. So I went back onto the RTE player and just captured the particular excerpt of the interview that crosses this topic. So I'm going to listen to that with you for the next couple of minutes and just maybe a slight reflection on it. So I have it in here, and I just play it here.
I believe, Brian, as a primary school principal, I remember attending
So the first thing is what captured my attention when he spoke yesterday. He said, "I believe as a primary school principal." So that interested me that, his professionally works as a primary school principal. So he's involved directly in the education of our first primary level education of students in Ireland. So his views to me are relevant to that extent, as well as his involvement in football. So just to replay that again, just to note that.
I believe, Brian, as a primary school principal, I remember attending a conference somewhere around 10 years ago where one of the topics was the lack of respect for decision makers and authority in general. That's 10 years ago, and I think.
So that's the topic. When I was listening to the news, that the lack of respect for decision makers and authority at all levels. So that struck me. It was wider than just football. I just thought about that. But let's listen to there's only about a minute or two of this interview, and let maybe have just some reflection on the wider implications or questions raised by that.
There's been an erosion in the respect for authority and decision makers at all levels in society in the last 10 years. And the GAA, because we cross every parish, and in our case in the county, is a reflection of society. And it has got to the stage where every decision is challenged, and you can see, I suppose, it manifests itself on social media as well. Now,
so that's really where that quote from the paper came from. But it is interesting when he introduced that it was a problem across all levels of society, while this discussion is around the behaviour and mistreatment of referees and the failure to accept decisions, etc., is a critical issue. So let's just wait. We'll listen to the rest of the interview, and then we come back to it.
In the extreme case, then it becomes where things can get out of hand from a physical point of view. But I just think there's an unacceptable level of challenging decisions across society. The GAA and the challenging of referees' decisions.
So, the point of frustration is that there's an unacceptable level of challenging decisions across society. So if you expand this to a much larger conversation than just what's happening in football, that's the sort of critical issue that interests me here.
You see it in professional sport. You see it at elite level, and that eventually trickles its way down. I think we've reached crisis point in this at the moment, and it's something that all policymakers, both from ourselves at county level, right through to national level in terms of the association, but also policymakers in sport, are going to have to sit down again and look at how we're going to address this.
In government, you're saying this needs to be elevated, if you like, to that level. What would you like to see government doing?
We can't pass the buck and say that government government can solve this, but I would like to see the policymakers across sport and across within the relevant departments sit down together and see how we can address this issue, and both the deterrence and the education. It is incumbent on all of us to ensure that we don't have an ongoing verbal or physical threat to referees.
And that's the chairman of the Wexford County Board, Micheál Martin. We're joined here in...
Okay, so that sets the sort of landscape for my reflection on this. So I see it as he said, it's a wider issue across all society. So, you know, his frustration is, and I see it actually in rugby this weekend. Some player is being examined in relation to rugby, in relation to his unacceptable response to a decision by a referee. And I have a sense that I notice in rugby, fairly small referees are able to control very big men. Once they say stop, it stops. So there's very good discipline within that sport. But, you know, so I'm looking at sort of two extremes. On one level, we've got the world of Ukraine and Russia, and from a Western perspective, or at least the propaganda that we've been given, nobody in Russia is allowed to question anything. So, you know, you're expected to accept everything and not challenge authority at all. So that's one extreme. And then we have the understandable extreme that Micheál Martin talks about there, is that every single decision being challenged at every single level of authority. At which stage, just for example, sport becomes unworkable. You know, I mean, the referee blows the whistle and said the ball, you know, my determination is that's a penalty. You know, I watch this all the time with VAR in soccer at the moment for the last 2 years. That's been in. And it's really interesting how when they used to have offside decisions and people that would argue about them afterwards, now, you know, we've transferred that over to technology, and, you know, the line is there and they draw the line and that's it, etc. A little bit more personal interpretation when it comes to handballs and fouls and all that sort of stuff, penalties. And it's interesting to see where the final authority decision in football, it seems to be that the final decision rests with the referee on the pitch. But on the other hand, I can see, let's say a referee makes a blatant error and simply refuses to listen to the match referee. How's he going to operate? What I think I read in rugby is that there's going to be some collaboration between the TMO operator, the television monitor operator, and the referees. And now they're going to place the dialogue that happens between those onto the public address system so that the public can hear the debates and conversations going on. And I just reflect that into a much larger situation in society. The idea of questioning any decision and any authority, any of the authority figures. I remember when taking part in a program on managing change in Sheffield University in the late 90s, this quotation came up when it relates to when you were a kid and you asked questions, you know, and the answer you were given by the adult was because. And I said, well, because what? Because, and I grew up saying because, and that's the why. And that shut me up. And I remember this Jim, who was one of the guys, he was actually a Reds from Glasgow, and I remember him saying, actually in Glasgow we had the response to why is, well, because why is the letter before Z? And you still didn't get an answer. And then I reflected on this other quotation that I'd picked up growing up: curiosity killed the cat, which in my memory was, again, when you were a kid and you asked awkward questions, you were basically slapped down for being curious. And I never heard the full element of that quotation, which I only learned later on in life, which is curiosity killed the cat, but information made him fat. And when I heard this, I realized not hearing the second part completely perverted the whole meaning of the quotation in the first place. The part that I had picked up, and I'm not saying from any specific, it just seems to me it was part of the culture that I came to understand, was keep your mouth shut, don't ask any questions, you know, your betters will tell you what to do, etc. And on one level that seemed to work okay, but it also, like in a benign dictatorship, it would work fine because you could trust whoever was in charge to do the right things. And it seems to me that the issue of asking questions or challenging authority, and whether that is at one extreme where you have what we're told is the Russian reality, but in fact, maybe the reality for a lot of us when you start asking awkward questions of being slapped down. And the other extreme of just preventing society from operating at all by constantly being allowed to ask vexatious and frivolous questions and challenges and being able to repeatedly appeal and appeal and appeal. And if you have enough money, you can keep the game spinning forever. So where do we find rational thinking? The other thing, yesterday I was listening to Claire Byrne shows I was driving along to, and I heard her say this, which I thought was trust is given and honesty is. Sorry, I did note this down somewhere. Will I just see right? Trust is given and honesty is presumed. I just thought that was interesting. That I can see how Covey talks about it he talks about the cost of a low trust society, the high economic cost of a low trust society. Where you have high levels of trust in any relationship or otherwise, a lot of stuff is taken as given. You don't have to spend a lot of time cross-checking everything. Takes a lot of the friction out of the system, saves a lot of money, etc. However, if you get into a low trust environment, you spend a lot of money ensuring, the trust but verify Reagan approach towards things. And, the levels of regulation and challenge to regulation increase, etc. So a lot of this comes back to the idea of, it's again the trust levels in society. What are the legitimacies and ethical values and practices of those in authority in the first place? And for me, it's interesting, Micheál Martin talked there about being at a conference 10 years ago. So let's say 10 years ago was, let's say around 2010. But really, for me as a 66-year-old, right through my coming of age in terms of awareness from, say, 1990 onwards, when I was, say, 32, 33 years of age, and becoming involved with having to be affected by authority figures and decision makers, and realizing even from just practical experience that I was being doled out decisions which were inequitable, unfair, were not based on any ratio dicendi or rationale or logic or equity. Some of them were based on culture. Some of them were based on, I suppose, a response to the fact that I had the audacity to ask for, please, sir, may I have some more? More? As in Oliver Twist. And, that since then, my personal journey has constantly been around when I meet an authority figure, I approach their behavior from a critical thinking perspective. So perhaps a little bit like the Ronald Reagan idea, trust but verify. So I listen to the authority figure, but I always question myself, is their behavior in this honest, authentic, independent, and equitable? Or is there an agenda here? And whose interest is actually being served? And as a result of that, I am prone to constantly support those who question things, whether they be whistleblowers or whatever. I'm prone to have a positive outlook and supporting perspective for someone who asks awkward questions. And for example, I look at the young Burke chap from Castlebar who's in jail in Mountjoy for contempt of court, or for failing to follow a court order not to attend at a school when he had been suspended because of his beliefs in relation to the description of somebody as they in a gender or whatever. But the part that was interesting to me is that he's certainly going against the mainstream and he's asking a question, and now he's in jail. And I'm not sure that the question is being addressed. And without knowing the detail of his arguments or otherwise, I just think that he's a fair, this is not somebody who's actually beating up old people in the street or dealing in drugs or stealing or guilty of white collar crime, and yet he's been deprived of his freedom. And certainly anybody else who might be thinking of asking awkward questions is not supported. If you look at the Sergeant Maurice McCabe experience, while it's true that it appears that he has now the recipient of some 5 million, if I understand the reports to be correct, of money for his pains, and presumably in his 60s, etc. Now he's not a poor man. Like there was a time back in 2014, if anybody remembers the really terrible, terrible behaviour by a chap called Oliver Connolly, the confidential recipient, who used all of his positional power as a well-known and lauded lawyer and connected with Enda Kenny and the Minister for Justice, Alan Shatter, to vilify Sergeant McCabe, who only was protected by virtue of that slim reality of him having a recording of a conversation, a recording which I believe has never actually been played in the public sphere. Now, it may have been played in the tribunal, but not in the public sphere. But without that recording, which at the time, in my personal conversations with people, I would say 95 to 98% of people I spoke to were of the belief that he had actually broken the law by making a recording of his conversation with Oliver Connolly. So we had a very ill-informed and misinformed societal understanding that recording your conversations with another person was illegal, which is quite separate from what Oliver Connolly was using as his argument, which was a person recording a third-party conversation between two other people, which itself, without their approval, is illegal. And he just happened to suitably mix up those issues. So it goes back to the thing. So what is okay in terms of question authority, and how? Like, do we want to move back? Even take the GAA. Do we simply have a situation that an incompetent or unfair referee, for example, can make unfair decisions, and you just have to suck it up and put up with it? For the sake of whatever the game, etc. And that extends into the rest of society. If you have someone who happens to be mistreated or inequitably treated, etc., by any authority figures, whether you're arrested by the guards and beaten up, or whether you are someone who experiences inequitable treatment, for example, if you happen to be a separated father and you experience discrimination against you in your role as a parent, do you just suck it up and put up and hope maybe that the culture shifts and things will come in your favour? Would it have been wrong for the women's movement to sit quiet for all those years and accept the inequitable treatment in terms of pay and conditions? Or should they have spoken out? What is righteous in that situation? And where does something pass from being a solid, valid, reasonable question to becoming a vexatious and frivolous question? And is that for those in authority and power simply to determine? So if I go in and challenge the behaviour, say, of a judge in a court, and if I have a feeling that that person is guilty of judicial misconduct, is it okay for the judge and his erstwhile friends, as they call themselves, colleagues in other words, that they use that term, friends, to determine their own members of judiciary and the legal profession? Is it okay for those people to simply say the querist, the challenger, that's me, is simply being vexatious and frivolous because I'm asking the awkward question? I'm just thinking here of a quotation by George Bernard Shaw that the reasonable man adapts to the world. The unreasonable man expects the world to adapt to him. Therefore, all change depends on the unreasonable man. In other words, like, if we all accept the status quo and don't question it, we're going to get more of the same. And by definition of standing out in the wind and say, excuse me, I beg to differ, or I hear a different drum beat, please, sir, may I have some more? Obviously, I'm going to piss off somebody in power, and they're going to be very unhappy. And, okay, we're hearing a version of what's happening in Ukraine and Russia from the Western perspective. But if we take that as it is, anybody in Russia who asks an awkward question simply gets locked up. But on the other hand, how are we dealing with people in the West who ask awkward questions? Like we've seen I mean, how many people in the whole whistleblower community say, for example, over the last 15 years, do you know of anybody other than Maurice McCabe who's managed to get a good whack of money out of this, or been recompensed or protected, or how many people have had their careers destroyed? So it's very hard to believe that someone with a genuine issue of whistleblowing is going to feel protected. The idea of protected disclosures to me is a complete joke, because we don't have a proven culture of supporting someone who makes a challenge. On the other hand, then we have the question of, what is a reasonable challenge, or what is a reasonable level of unreasonableness? So I suppose for me, what I think that someone who challenges authority, and it's often very hard to do this, one needs to do it in a cool, calm, and calculated way. So, ventilating your spleen with expletives and roaring at people, etc., is not very helpful. On the other hand, to be fair, if your balls have been squeezed and you're screaming, that's because your balls have been squeezed. You may have a good argument about why they shouldn't be, but you're in pain. So I think we have to have some latitude for someone who comes in. Like, for example, I'm thinking of, let's say, someone who's experienced sexual and emotional, but sexual abuse, say, and they have been damaged and terribly and irreparably. And if they, when they come out and talk about this, are very angry, etc., I think it is really incumbent upon all of us when we listen to allow some latitude for that emotional outburst, and I think to create a space whereby that emotion is addressed and that person is helped to. When I say calm down, I don't mean calm down and shut up or something like that. I mean come to, okay, so let's move past the emotional state and then let's look at the data. And I think for the authority figures themselves and for the structures of our society, whether they be in sport or otherwise, we then have to have a truly independent and impartial process, which is based on seeking to uncover, discover, expose auditable and traceable evidence in relation to this various allegations. And to do this in a cold and dispassionate way. Now, on one level, one would be led to believe that this is what the judicious and judicial process is about, which is deaf, dumb, and blind, or whatever, that doesn't take sides. The reality of the law and court and the intimidation of everybody in the theatre by the other actors in the theatre. I mean, law as practiced is a theatre-based process, and so much of the outcomes are based not on the logic, the rationale of the information provided, but on the performance of the various actors, and of the personal disposition of judges. So, I mean, how often, if you've had any experience of going to court, would the legal advisors you meet pay attention and, turn their attention to, well, who's actually hearing this case, this particular judge? So we'll prepare our disposition and our proposition, and we'll personally tailor it to how the receptivity of that particular judge. Now, that's not like artificial intelligence here. There's not an awful lot of independence there. You're just playing it's a bit like football. You're just strategizing the situation rather than looking at what's right and wrong. The other thing is that in any situation where you have an underdog challenging authority, the likelihood is that underdog is not going to be well resourced or well equipped. And, as the power differential between those in authority and the person who's challenging authority increases, the chances are that you've got a fairly blubbering, semi-illiterate individual roaring and screaming, trying to make a point, and under pressure, and challenging somebody who is particularly comfortable in their position, who is well regarded in a collegially defended system. Whether, like for example, I remember in the case in Drogheda, I forget the Neary case in Drogheda, where about symphysiotomy, I think it was, but I remember them talking about the difficulty of getting an independent view in a collegiate system where, they all look after each other. And, whether it's, I don't know who said the professions were the conspiracy against the people. I'm not sure. That was also Bernard Shaw. But the problem is, how do you get independent and fair and evaluation, and in the environment in which that happens? I mean, how is the individual supported in terms of making their argument? And again, one should say, well, actually, why don't you get your solicitor to represent your argument? But a lot of cases, in my experience, my personal experience, I think trying to get somebody of that ilk, um, who may not be committed to your cause, does that matter? Should you just be able to hire a solicitor? Doesn't matter, or a barrister, and know that they'll perform their best for you, whether they believe you or not. Like, I'm too long in the tooth and I've no hair. I don't believe that. I just don't believe it. I would love to believe that there was a situation that if I have 5 arguments and you have 5 arguments, and in the round my arguments have more merit than your arguments, then I believe the outcome should be that my arguments would win out. And vice versa. If your arguments are of a higher, better merit than mine, yours should win out. And that both of us should win in regard that both of us are now better informed and some the wiser as a result of it. That's not been my experience. So when I hear of the challenges that in this interview have been held to the authority figures throughout, I see how it, when it's carried out to the extreme, it's really terrible. Like, and the fact that man, Micheál Martin, is a primary school principal, I can imagine this in school, like increasingly the idea of rebellious children, whereas like when I was in school, you certainly didn't say no to the teacher. Now we can see people saying, I want you to call me this, or I want you to call me that, and if you don't, I'll get rid of your job and all that stuff, and I'll complain to this person the other way. So you can kill off all level of authority. Like, you can imagine if the guards go out to Cherry Orchard to try and deal with the the joyriding and all that sort of stuff, and if they stop and tackle the joyriders and say, under this act, I'm going to arrest you, and people say, you touch me and I'll lodge a complaint to the Garda complaints body, etc., and that the Gardaí then become afraid to act. This would mean, like, we'd have no control over society at all. This is a terrible thing, which is why I was drawn to what that man said about education. We've got to look at the deterrence and education. And in reality, ultimately, society can only, I think, in a fair society, mature society, democratic society, it can only operate smoothly and sustainably if 2 things happen. When the public have to support the concept of authority, and they have to buy into it. So, for example, I want to support the Garda Síochána. I want to support the regulations that we have in our society. I want to support the government when it makes decisions in COVID terms in the public interest. How and ever. That's, again, trust is, that line again, trust is given, honesty is presumed. The problem is, when I give my trust in the authority figure, I'm making a presumption of honesty. And when Stephen Covey talks about the cost of trust in a low trust and high trust societies, I believe it's not just over the last 10 years, but certainly in my adult lifetime, I have seen this erosion of trust by ordinary people, and certainly by me, in authority figures. And they are for very good reason. They are being because of constant, endless exposure of corruption at all levels. And in my personal experience, I have never seen those people in authority who have been guilty of misconduct, professional misconduct, I've not seen an appropriate level of accountability, level of punishment, or even correction, and certainly not an adequate deterrence to prevent this happening in future. And I think, and of course, we're all, as citizens, we're all guilty of this, because, in Thelma and Louise, the movie, the famous line I picked up, you get what you settle for. We have settled for this. I mean, we re-elect people, like, for example, in the RT investigates into the councillors taking bribes. I mean, endless numbers of those people have been re-elected. And so if we re-elect people who do this, what we're basically saying this is okay. And the other thing is, Michael Martin there, he's a principal of a primary school. So how do you impart to primary school children, very impressionable young children, the very concept of authority, fairness? How do we educate those people to think critically and to act critically? I mean, you back in 2011 at the McGill Summer School, I heard Rory Quinn at it was then Minister for Education, and he was espousing the idea that we really want to develop a nation of critical thinkers. I'm thinking, Rory, the last person you want to have anybody is somebody who's thinking critically about maybe you. He'll ask you an awkward question. Because I never met any of those guys who, when you asked them a serious question, were delighted. Oh yes, I'm delighted to hear you, and I will respond authentically to your question. It's a big ask. On the other hand, as society becomes more nuanced and more complicated, me personally, I think the big challenge is how to educate critical thinking, how to support a challenging classroom. You know, how to create what to some people might see as chaos, but which I would call chaotic behavior, where where much of the learning is based on query and challenge rather than on rote memory retrieval and repeating that which is the Ten Commandments or something. Driving learning through the concept of curiosity. And it's not even empowering, because I don't like that word, empowering the student, but actually removing the shackles from the student and removing the requirement of the teacher role in the class being seen as the sage on the stage. You know, I taught you all you know, but I didn't teach you all I know. And to move to a situation that you can accept the expertise of an individual and respect that while not blindly following everything they say. And that a wise leader or teacher constantly operates on the basis of, so far in my experience and in my research, I know this. This is my thoughts on this situation, and I base that on this evidence that I've collected through my life. How and ever, if you bring to me new information, I'd heard Sting say, when the facts change, my opinion changes, and then researched that and found it was Maynard Keynes in maybe the 40s something who said that originally, when the facts change, my opinion changes. So if leaders and those authority figures were able to imbibe the concept of openness to the possibility that their original view may not be correct, while not become blubbering fools, indecisive, that's not the issue. But yeah, it's a complex issue. I don't know what your thoughts are on this. I keep saying, I used to say, does it matter? I'm not even sure, does it matter if it matters anymore? But I did find the comments, and I'll go back to the newspaper article on the comments, or the comment by Micheál Martin, about there being an erosion of respect and authority for decision makers at all levels in society in that time. That was in the last 10 years. And he regarded this as a crisis, which I agree. I think it is a crisis. I think, for example, in the phenomenal threat that we face in relation to the world we're at right now, which is associated with COVID over the last couple of years, the ultimate global fear of pandemics, and the question of, are there agendas and conspiracies behind that? The issue between East and West, between Russia and Ukraine and all that stuff. It's become, as we in the West, if we call it, trust our leaders less. So if you look at America and you look at Trump and you look at the Democrats, and you look at how they treat the ad hominem in all cases as more relevant to their thought processes than independent facts. I mean, even the idea of fact checking, it's a relatively recent, I think, term, fact checking. And the other idea, a quotation I saw from Mark Twain on Facebook recently, I thought was interesting, that if you don't read the newspapers, you're uninformed. And if you do read the newspapers, you're misinformed. So that's, I think, I think if I was 20 again and had all this stuff going on in me head around that confusion, I think I would find it very hard to know which way to move forward. That's if I cared enough to think about that. It would be a lot easier just to not think about that and just to go in some flow, either be with the anti crowd or with the pro crowd, but not being aware and alive and awake. I think that's the crisis. So that's a thought for the afternoon, right here from the edge of the Wild West Atlantic coast in Donegal. Okay, good luck.